given Trump's track record, I think many people were worried, before the US election that, we might see something like this. But I think everyone generally, is pretty shocked at the, chain of events that we've seen, both, in the Munich Security Conference and then obviously subsequently in the last few days. And there, must be massive concern now about whether the US will continue its support to Ukraine. The military support in particular, that's really, really important. I mean, as I've written in various things I've said, there was a chance for a peace deal here, right? I think whoever would have won the US election, whether it was Harris or Trump, I think both sides actually wanted to sit down at the negotiating table. I think actually Trump had lots of leverage. All the cards were in his hand. Putin wanted peace talks. Sanctions have been hurting the Russian economy has been weakening. Obviously, the military cost has been significant, and Trump could have ramped up sanctions, ramped up support for Ukraine, military support to put more pressure on Putin. And there was lots of things to negotiate around, right? NATO membership, security guarantees, territory, and then the whole sanctions kind of piece. And unfortunately, Trump, the great negotiator, the guy with the art of the deal, has given everything away. It's just utterly extraordinary, how any negotiator would give, the house away to Putin. And I think the Russians they just can't believe their luck. And actually, Moscow is pushing out its maximalist agenda, which, essentially is, no security forces at all, no security for Ukraine, essentially. I think they'll be pushing the limitations on Ukraine's military capability, and also this idea of pushing for early elections, which they know what it means. That's to destabilize Ukraine. Trump is absolutely wrong, right? I noticed Gabbard, the head of the security agencies in the US, was commenting that this is unconstitutional. Ukraine, it's not unconstitutional. It's absolutely constitutional. At a time of war, it's constitutional not to have elections in Ukraine, and all political parties have agreed on that. The consequences of, let's say, the scenario that Trump and Putin are playing out, which is a ceasefire deal, then elections, and then some final deal. Early elections, when a firm deal is not agreed, it will mean the end of martial law and mobilization. That will surely deplete Ukraine's front lines. It will see an exodus of men from the country. And that means that Ukraine won't be able to defend itself. And the Russians know this. And Trump has fallen for it. Now, either Trump has no clue on Ukraine, he's clueless on the whole story, or he's a terrible negotiator, or he's an asset of the Russians. There's one of those three, I think. But it's quite extraordinary, the developments we've seen, and they've weakened Ukraine, undoubtedly, as a consequence of that. But interestingly, I think from talking to Ukrainians, and certainly the message from Kyiv is, actually, it's hard and resolving Ukraine. They say, well, what is in it for us, right? What is this deal? We're giving everything up. What's the point of that? We may as well just fight on. Things may change in the future. We may get something in the future, right? And it's increased support for Zelensky, I think. We've seen Zaluzhny, the former head of the army, who's seen as a potential competitor in future presidential elections, come out and say, we don't want early presidential elections. Tymoshenko, obviously former prime minister, also came out with a pretty strong statement saying the thing. So it's unified Ukrainian society again behind Zelensky, and to basically sustaining the opposition, the defense against Russian aggression. The reality is that early elections, or elections, I should say, would more likely, well, either Zelensky may win them now, given the rallying support behind him, or you'll end up with someone who, like Zaluzhny, who's you could argue is more hardline on peace negotiation. He's argued for full mobilization, Ukraine going on to full war footings. It is, the irony is unbelievable that an autocracy, a dictatorship, Russia, that has seen two presidents in 25 years, one of them was the shoe-in between Putin and Medvedev, and where opposition politicians are killed, are murdered by the regime, is calling out, a country like Ukraine that has had multiple, tens of presidential parliamentary elections. I think has had 5 or 6 presidents in the period since independence. Transition of power have been smooth. Elections have been free and fair. It's extraordinary for Russia to try and call out Ukraine as not being democratic, and for Trump to take the bait is utterly extraordinary. Zelensky is not a dictator. Putin is the dictator. That should be crystal clear to everyone. And you have to question Trump's motives for saying that kind of thing. And the whole of his team. Are they sycophants, or do they not understand how important this is? Do they care more about their jobs than actually calling out the truth on something that should be a number one national security interest for the West, not just Europe? But anyway, they should look into their consciences, I guess, in the future. Ukraine can fight on. I think there's a willingness now in the population, realization that why accept a bad deal? Something like 40% of munitions are now made in Ukraine. I think Europe will continue to supply finance and some munitions. Obviously, the US is critical for particularly some of the air defense weapons, but I think there is an ability to fight on for six months, maybe a year. Russia hasn't proven able to take much more territory. It's been brutal on the ground, and I think militarily, I don't think Russia has the ability to take and hold a significant amount of territory. Europe still has options. And one of the positives is Ukraine's finances are in reasonably good shape. They're still, they've got 40 odd billion in foreign exchange reserves. There's still the availability of this 50 billion ERA, which is the interest stream on frozen Russian assets, or debt secured on the back of the interest stream on frozen Russian assets. And there's I think a 40 billion plus left of the EU macro financial assistance program. So Ukraine has well over $100 billion of finance that could get it through the year. That's been about more or less the cost of funding the war. And it could use that money to buy munitions, right? Hopefully Trump wouldn't reject a big fat check coming his way to buy weapons. And, it does, the easiest thing for Europe to do, again, is this frozen Russian asset issue. It's just ridiculous that Europe is sitting on well in excess of 200 billion of Central Bank of Russia assets, most in Belgium. The ECB has been blocking it. I would challenge the ECB. Their main concern is the impacts on the euro as a reserve currency and trust in the euro as a reserve currency. What's going to be trust in Europe and confidence in the euro if Ukraine falls because we fail to adequately finance and arm them? What do you think your precious euro is going to do then? The need is now. Absolutely, we just need to sign the money over to a fund. It can be managed by Europeans and the Ukrainians, but essentially to be available for the Ukrainians to fund their own defense, right? Again, purchases from the Americans, lots of places in the world that Ukrainians can buy munitions beyond the US. But having access to that cash is going to be critical to sustaining Ukraine's defense in the absence of support from the Americans, basically. And remember, likely, if we don't do that soon, the Trump administration will likely sign a lot of that money back over to Russia. That would be extraordinary. That Europe and Ukraine loses. That money gets paid back. The aggressor doesn't pay anything for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. It gets away scot-free. Morally, that would be an utter disaster, right? And again, I would just ask European politicians, stop talking, act, do. Easy to do, really easy to do. It requires a few signatures, not difficult. Cash is sitting in bank accounts, right? It's just the ECB and a few treasuries in European countries that are blocking it. it needs to be done. You're either serious about European security or you're not. And I don't think the ECB leadership should be taking these decisions, actually. It's about European national security. So those decisions should be taken out of their hands. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the damage done by Hegseth and Vance at Munich was extraordinary. I find it incredible to say this, but I think NATO is dead, right? I mean, Europe is on its own. It's crystal clear. We cannot, the US is no longer a dependable ally for Europe, right? If Trump really thinks it's better to ally with Putin, the guy who has invaded 3 European countries, has killed people with weapons of mass destruction on the streets of the UK, is constantly doing malign activity against European democracies, has tried to assassinate the leader of, or the CEO of the main German arms manufacturer, that if Trump thinks that it's fine to cut deals and be in allegiance with Moscow, then I think our interests and values are quite different from the Americans, and we have to think elsewhere. And you're right. I think Putin will look to test what's left of Article 5. I mean, the Baltic states must be very nervous at this stage, right? Can they defend themselves? Is European NATO able to help them? Because Putin is definitely willing to do it, right? I have no doubts. And again, I've covered Russia in its various guises since the mid-80s. It's almost 40 years covering this space. I have no doubt that Putin has the willingness to go further in Europe beyond Ukraine. No doubt. And most of the Putin and Russia watchers I know and follow are the same view, right? So that's the harsh reality. So if the Americans think that they have different interests and values, then we need to think about other arrangements in Europe. And obviously, it's our fault, Europeans' fault. We haven't taken the threat from Russia seriously enough for a long time. We haven't taken the need to bolster our own security. Yes, we've been over-reliant on the Americans, so we need to wake up very quickly. And obviously, finance is a key part of that. The immobilized Russian assets in European jurisdictions would be really, really important in backstopping Ukrainian finance and the military component, but also Europe itself. We need to move really, really fast. I also find it pretty extraordinary, actually, that Macron convened that meeting of larger European powers in Paris, didn't include Turkey. I mean, how is that possible? Turkey has the biggest armed forces in European NATO. It's done a lot to support Ukraine in terms of provision of drones. Why wasn't Turkey invited? That's utterly extraordinary. The one country in Europe, European NATO, is able to field tens of thousands of troops to help secure a peace is Turkey, and it's not invited. I mean, it just is utterly extraordinary. He's reaffirmed Turkey's support for Ukraine's NATO membership, right, which is certainly a positive. Again, Europe has its problems. The relationship between Turkey is a difficult one, right? There's fault on both sides, I would say. But unfortunately, I'd say it's underlying this is a xenophobia, right? I mean, that reluctance to engage with Turkey on this issue. We have to. I would argue that in the face of the Russian threat, we need to boost military industrial cooperation with the Turks. They have a huge army. They have a big military industrial complex. They have particular specialisms, particularly in drones, the Bayraktar, the Baykar, Bayraktar kind of drones and company. Excel, interesting. Baykar recently bought an aeronautical company in Italy. Right. So, we need to do more of that, right? In our own interest, in our own defense, right? And the Russians are no real friends of, the Turks are no real friends of the Russians. They get the threat. Absolutely. Right. But they're very transactional, and, they understand that, they have supplied significant munitions to Ukraine. And the quid pro quo for that has unfortunately been that they've, had to pay for Russian gas and take Russian tourists, right? And but needs must. And I think the Ukrainians certainly appreciate what Turkey has done for them. And they can do a lot more in terms of any peace because they have the military capability. The UK has its own specific problems, right? We're in a difficult economic situation. We have large levels of public debt. We have a big budget deficit. Obviously, markets are very focused on our vulnerabilities, right? So Reeves, the Chancellor, is constrained. I think there is the understanding in the leadership in the UK that we need to increase defence spending, but there's the economic and market realities of how do we do it? How do we get it funded, right? Interesting. I mean, putting a few things together, I don't think the Ukrainians would mind at all if Europe released the 200 billion plus of immobilized Russian assets to divert those to fund a security force to be deployed in its defense in Ukraine itself, right? I mean, the UK military budget's about $60 billion. So it puts some perspective on, potentially releasing the 200 billion plus of immobilized Russian assets. Actually, in the UK, we have something like $25 billion of immobilized Russian assets in cash in the UK. So, that would cover more or less half UK's annual defense spending. That would be more than enough to cover the cost of increased military spending associated with a defense operation or security operation in Ukraine, right? And remember, the total amount of immobilized Russian assets in Western jurisdictions is about central bank itself, 330 billion total. Immobilized Russian assets about 400 billion total. So, if we release the whole amount, it would more than cover, a significant military intervention or security operation in Ukraine. I mean, I guess the problem is it's not really the finance. I don't think finance is the problem here. The problem is simply getting the kit quickly enough, right? And Europe has wasted the last 3 years in terms of not rebuilding its military industrial complex. So we're not able to field the tanks, the aircraft, and the troops that's required. It's not really a problem of money. It's a problem of production of the technology itself, military technology itself, right? No, the Ukrainians say themselves. I mean, around 40% of their munitions are now made in the country. So that gives them ability to sustain a defense for some time. Although it's only relatively low tech stuff they make. They make some long range missiles, but unfortunately the resupply of things like Patriot missiles and HIMARS, that comes from the States, right? So in the end, you have to go to Trump, with a big check and say, "Will you sell me these, please?" For the defense of Ukraine. I mean, that's the question. I think if the check's big enough, Trump will not say no. And, if you, I argued on the $330 billion of immobilized Russian assets, create a specific fund, the Defense of Democracy in Europe Fund, call it the Trump Fund for the Defense of Democracy in Europe, and take that to him and say, look, we're willing to spend $300 billion over the next 10 years buying US kit. It could be $500 billion. I mean, if you put into perspective, if Europe steps up from, it's a $25 trillion economy, Europe, in effect. So 2% of GDP defense spending is roughly 500 billion. Each percentage point is 250 billion, right? Let's say we're going to go to 4% of GDP. That's about $1 trillion of defense spending. US spends about 800 billion. If we're going to $1 trillion, I would imagine a lot of that will be spent buying US equipment, right? Europe can be a huge market for the US defense sector. And, if Europe and Ukraine go to Trump and say, we want to commit 500 billion of defense purchases over the next 10 years, 50 billion a year, will be the biggest defense sale contract ever. And, put Trump's name on it. He likes those kind of things. I don't think he could say no, right? Just the number of jobs that would create, right? So, we have to be cleverer. Our politicians have sat on their backsides, I'm afraid, for 3 years, not done very much, right? They've been to Kiev, they've had photo opportunities, whatever, with Zelensky, but they've gone back home and they haven't done anything, right? I mean, we haven't really increased our ability to make stuff in Europe. Interestingly, going back to Turkey, Turkey does have the manufacturing capability. It can scale up very quickly to make a lot of tanks and military equipment and 155mm shells. So we need to be working. We need to be cleverer now. Russia is an existential threat to Europe. Europe, with Turkey, has to come up for solutions, right? And I think Turkey would be a willing partner in this defense, because it has no interest in the Black Sea being dominated by Russia. It has no interest in Russia taking over Ukraine and its military-industrial complex. It's a rival in many places. Syria has been one, obviously, that has been in the focus in recent months. So Turkey has an interest, I think, in keeping Ukraine sovereign and secure, and also Europe sovereign and secure. And it would certainly help its economy if we see more cooperation in the defence sector between Europe and the Turks. Incredible. I think anyone who's read the document that Treasury Secretary Besant went to Kyiv with, I think, would be left in shock. I mean, the US essentially committed to nothing, really. Nothing nothing clear cut, nothing specific in terms of either financial or military support for Ukrainians. But the suggestion was pretty clear. It gets 50% of almost everything. I mean, that's extraordinary, really, if you think about it. I mean, the blood that Ukrainians have bled for democracy and Europe and Western security, and for the Americans to go over and try and demand that back. I mean, there's been talk of a $500 billion payback for the Americans. They've only actually spent about $115 billion. I mean, that's the reality. So it's a 5-to-1 payback. That's utterly extraordinary, right? And the suggestion that they're kind of playing the Russians off against the Ukrainians, again, I mean, morally repugnant, I think, and not something that you would expect of an ally, right? And I think Europe has now got the message, right? The Americans are no longer a trusted ally. They're an adversary. We have different interests. We have different values. We need to come up with our own security and defense infrastructure, etc. So, I mean, incredible couple of weeks. I think no one really imagined, even with the Trump presidency, that it would be this bad. But I'd leave on one final point. I mean, I get the US has its own interests, right? I mean, it views China as its number one strategic competitor risk. I get that, right? But that China is not our number one national security risk. Russia is. Now, if the US wants our assistance in the future in helping it in that future competition with China and potentially a military clash with China, I think they need to be a bit more understanding of our own interests and what is important to us. Otherwise, when that battle with China eventually happens, Europe's not going to be there like it was after 9/11. The US will be on its own. So, people like Hegseth and Vance need to think pretty clearly about that. You are losing loyal allies that have fought alongside you in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and shed blood and treasure, with the US. I mean, do you really want that, right? I mean, it seems very short-sighted. I mean, it's almost, I was thinking, it's almost like a cowboy. It's not a cowboy kind of policy. It's a bandits. It's a policy of a banditry, a pirate.
It's mafia. It's mafia-led, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just utterly extraordinary kind of a shift. And I think the message globally to everyone is the US cannot be trusted. I mean, that's a message that will, go out. If allies cannot rely on the Americans, no one can. Well, look, my initial take was possibly not just because the UK had sanctioned Lukoil and Rosneft the week before, and there hadn't been much impact. And then subsequently, actually, the oil price rallied, actually. It went up 4 or 5% on the back of it. I mean, maybe that says quite a lot about how seriously the world and the market takes the UK, actually, and its ability to police the sanctions that it's rolled out. I think a few things of note with respect to the US sanctions, in particular on Rosneft and Lukoil. Firstly, there's a 4-week implementation phase. This is Donald Trump, and he does flip-flop. So there is possibly still a risk, I guess, that he has a change of heart and Putin does something, reaches out to him, and we see him delaying implementation, which is kind of a possibility. Assuming that is not the case and they are rolled out, and then obviously a lot depends on implementation and secondary sanctions or sanctions imposed to police, these particular sanctions. So basically, secondary sanctions on companies that still want to do business with Rosneft and Lukoil and other Russian entities that have already been sanctioned, right? Unfortunately, the experience so far in the 3.5 years, actually almost a decade, if you go back to the first imposition of sanctions after the annexation of Crimea, sanctions on Russia. Unfortunately, secondary sanctions have been pretty weak. Enforcement has been pretty weak. We've given Russia lots of time and opportunity to get around the sanctions. Obviously, we've had the evolution of the shadow fleet, which has been one of the key ways in which Russia has avoided the existing sanctions on waterborne oil exports from Russia. So, look, it depends on that. There are lots of still moving parts. Initially the market was surprised, I think, because they'd assumed, like myself, that Trump wasn't serious about doing anything particularly on Russia, and this came out of the blue a bit, and everyone's taken aback a bit. But we'll have to see. The noise initially from certainly the Indians and the Chinese has been pretty cautious, right? Both have suggested that they will, in fact, row back and reduce their imports from Russia. They're worried, obviously, about secondary sanctions, particularly banks that facilitate this trade. So that's good news if that's the reality, right? That will squeeze Russia. It will mean that it will be more costly for Russia to try and get around these sanctions. It'll have to offer a discount, a more significant discount for individuals or companies or whatever, countries that still want to trade with it, to make it worth their while and make them risk running the secondary sanctions gauntlet of the West. So if Trump's serious, if there's proper enforcement, this will further withhold revenues to the Russian state. It will make it more difficult for Russia to wage this war. It will impose additional costs on the Russian economy and the Russian population. That's the hope anyway. Europe in particular and the West wanted to cut Russian energy out of its energy supply chain, right? Firstly, Russia had held Europe blackmail in the period in the lead up to the full-scale invasion, and then afterwards, trying to use energy to enforce its geopolitical objectives, right? So Europe wanted to reduce that vulnerability, right? So we saw efforts to cut, to ban actually not just oil and gas, but coal, seaborne crude oil deliveries were banned in Europe. And we've been reducing pipeline gas and obviously pipeline oil, and the European Union suggested they're going to cut, I think by 2027, Russian pipeline oil and gas out of the kind of chain. I guess then the second part of it, you reduce your own vulnerability to this blackmail, and secondly, you want to reduce the revenue flows to Russia. That's more difficult, obviously, because if you stop Russia's exports onto global markets, you increase global energy, you create a shortage, you increase global energy prices, and actually you may well increase revenue flows to Russia. So the Biden administration, were wanted to divert, exports from Europe somewhere else. The Indians and the Chinese took advantage of that. India, which wasn't particularly a large importer of Russian energy, started to buy lots of Russian oil at discounted prices. The oil price cap If you remember the $60 a barrel oil price cap that the European Union imposed a year or so back, massively helped the Indians, and likely they benefited, in tens of billions of dollars of cheap energy. Good for India. You could argue that it was worth profiteering. Maybe the Ukrainians would argue that. But at least it prevented a disruption of global energy markets, which could have been a systemic global problem, and obviously may have been counterproductive in terms of it would have enabled Russia to actually earn more revenues if prices had been increased. I think it's going to be interesting this time around with both Indian and Chinese companies pulling back from buying Russian energy. Much has been made of the fact that the timing is somewhat opportune in terms of oil prices have moderated quite significantly. Obviously, because of tariffs, global growth has slowed down, demand for energy is reduced, there's more supply come on stream, and there's a surplus of something like around 3.5 million barrels a day of oil. The Saudis obviously have lots of excess production. Maybe there's a deal between Trump and the Saudis to take Russian market share, right? Saudi Arabia itself, MBS still has very ambitious reform objectives, Vision 2030. It's very, NEOM and these big projects are very expensive. Oil prices going from an average of $80 a barrel under the Biden administration to something like 60 now really hurts the Saudis, right? The budget deficit's increased. They're going to have to borrow more. So, if the Saudis can make up for that lower oil price by bringing more supply to the market and taking Russian oil off the market, it's kind of a win-win. And obviously, Trump is eager to work with Saudi Arabia in terms of the Middle East peace process. So maybe there's a deal behind the scenes there that somehow can freeze the Russians out. Let's hope so, because in the end, all this is about reducing the revenue stream to Russia, as I mentioned, making sure the Russian war machine is not as well funded as it is at the moment. In recent weeks and months, Trump has been resisting doing more sanctions on Russia. And the argument's been, look at Europe. It's importing all this Russian energy. Let's wait for Europe to move first. And the irony is that the countries that are importing most Russian energy are actually friends of Putin, like Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia, right? So, the European Union is saying, yes, we're very eager to stop Russian energy imports. But then, again, Orban and Fico have been saying we can't do it. Technically it's possible, right? From what I understand. Hungary can get oil supplies through Croatia. That's LNG, maybe bought from the Americans, but LNG. And actually, already the gas transit has, I think, more or less stopped. The Ukrainians stopped that. There's been a lot of tax on Ukrainian gas transit, gas supply and production in Ukraine. It's physically possible for those countries, and technically possible for those countries to stop imports of Russian energy. They argue that it's just going to be more expensive, right? So I presume they're looking for some kind of bailout from the European Union for that. That's typical of Orban. He criticizes the European Union. Meanwhile, Hungary's been a recipient of tens, actually hundreds of billions of euros in EU structural fund flows. So, he wants his cake and he wants to eat it, I think. Yes, and you mentioned the attacks on energy infrastructure. The Ukrainians in their attacks on Russia proper have been increasingly successful, right, in recent months. There's a lot of focus, I think, on the fact that the war in Ukraine is something of a stalemate. Actually, it feels a little bit like, we could be at something of a turning point in terms of, for me, one of the sides could get a technological advantage here, right? It's about innovation. It's not a war of attrition, it's a war of iteration, right? Which side gets the technological advantage, particularly in drones and counter-drone warfare? And it looks like the Ukrainians have got something of an advantage now in this deep strike drones, right? They're increasingly successful in hitting Russian refinery production. They've probably hit something like 30% of Russian facilities, taken off stream something like a fifth. That's hurting Russia, definitely. We're seeing queues at the gas stations, higher prices for refined products domestically. the Russians have stopped exports of some refined products, which again shows how the difficulties they're in. Now, the challenge for Ukraine, they may have found drones that have a much higher success rate. Their challenge will be going to scale, right? It's identifying drones and technology that works in terms of hitting Russian facilities, but then scaling it up, going from tens produced a day to hundreds, thousands produced a day that can have a seismic impact on Russia. I tend to think that Russia's actions in the last month or so of escalation in terms of its forays, either with drones or MiG-31s into airspace of NATO countries, reflects the fact that the Ukrainians have been increasingly successful at hitting Russia at home, particularly refineries, right? So I think the Russians are looking more vulnerable than they've been for a long time, right? The economy is weaker. Definitely the Ukrainians have identified vulnerabilities, particularly in terms of refineries. And now we have, this latest action with the Lukoil Rosneft sanctions that, if properly rolled out, again, could be pretty important. If we can figure out the details of it, it definitely covers the financing shortfall that Ukraine likely faces in the next year or two because the Americans have stepped back in terms of financing. Remember, the Americans were providing about 40% of the $100 billion a year of annual financing to keep Ukraine in the war. Without the Americans, the Europeans will have to cover that shortfall. It's a lot of money. European countries face, very difficult fiscal positions. UK, for example, I mean, Rachel Reeves in the UK is having to find, either spending cuts or increased taxes to cover a big financing shortfall. I don't think there's appetite in the UK to suddenly double its £5 billion a year contribution to Ukraine, and it's the same across Europe, right? Look at the French fiscal position, domestic politics in France. So I don't think there's appetite from taxpayers in Europe to pay more. And when there's this Russian taxpayer money sitting doing nothing in bank accounts, I just think there's no alternative. So I think, the Belgians have kind of pushed back a bit. They have concerns about sharing liability or sharing the risks, I should say, in a very unlikely scenario where Russia takes legal action to recover the funds. The Belgians say, well, actually, the risk should be shared across Europe and G7. That's fair.
That sounds fair, yeah.
It's a little bit surprising in my mind that other European countries have not raised their hands and said, yes, that's a reasonable thing to ask for. Let's go and do it. The point's been made that countries don't want to be on the hook. They don't want their taxpayers to be on the hook for hundreds of billions of dollars if these funds are used down the line. The counter I'd make to it is, well, the alternative is the taxpayer has to pay hundreds of billions of dollars now, right? So I don't get the logic of our politicians, right? They think it's better to spend hundreds of billions of dollars of our taxpayer money now to set against the possible risk, a very low risk in my mind, that 30 years from now, when this reparation loan falls due, the Russian state may come in knocking at the door saying, actually, we want all this money back. It seems perverse, right? But I think, in the end, a deal will be done, and I think it will be done this year because there is no alternative. 330 billion covers Ukraine's financing needs for 2 to 3 years. It sends a really strong message to Putin that Ukraine's well funded. It can sustain itself in this war for a very long time. It changes the calculus for Putin himself. As you mentioned, we should be very innovative in how we use this money. I argued just prior in terms of the challenge will be, taking the best innovation that we've seen from the Ukrainians in terms of these deep strike and getting to scale, right? Scale production, that costs money. If you produce the scale in Ukraine, there are lots of issues. The corruption issue has always been there, but the risks of Russia hitting Ukrainian drone manufacturing facilities. So it makes some sense for this finance to be used to fund manufacture of drones in scale in NATO countries. And the big advantage is that we get, the technology exchange. We learn best practice from the Ukrainians. I guess those Russian forays of drones into NATO airspace over the last month or so has just underlined the absence of drone defense in Europe, and the fact that actually we're dependent on the Ukrainians for our defense already, right? All those countries that has been subject to those drone attacks are now asking the Ukrainians to help them in terms of drone defense, right? So, it's really, really important, I think, that we coordinate finance, scale production, and innovation with the Ukrainians to help our own defense. In the UK in particular, the Starmer government announced, I think, a plan to produce create 6 munitions factories. I'm not sure finance is available for those, but a good idea would be to use some of the £25 billion of immobilized Russian assets in the UK to maybe, for at least build one of those factories in cooperation with the Ukrainians to produce drones for Ukraine and for the UK military, right? I mean, it would seem like a no-brainer, but sometimes things that seem obvious and a no-brain solution, it takes our governments many months or years to do the obvious. I think we can probably both talk about the UK defence procurement experience, right? I mean, there's been a long, long track record of disasters. I remember the replacement for the Nimrod aeroplane. I mean, battlefield communication systems, you name it. The UK has been terrible in many of these, really big defence procurement projects. We can learn a lot from the Ukrainians, I think, right? And it is extraordinary what the UK can do in a short period of time in terms of getting supplies to the Ukrainians that we can't actually get to our own military in the same kind of time frame, right? So, needs must in extraordinary times of danger and peril, things happen, right? So, but yes, I mean, look, clearly what's happening in Ukraine is the frontier of warfare, our future battles, future warfare, our own defense. I think, what goes on in Ukraine, our own defense will be determined by what goes on in Ukraine. We need to learn really fast from that. And I think, I think UK military and European militaries and NATO militaries, I think, are trying their best to figure out what's going on in Ukraine. But it's very fast moving, right? I mean, a drone that may well be very successful this week may not work next week because the Russians figure out some kind of countermeasure against it, right? So again, it's a war of iteration, as I mentioned, right? And I guess the danger a little bit is, it feels a little bit like First World War, late First World War, maybe like 1917, invention of the tank, where, some invention could fundamentally shape the battlefield in favor of one or the other combatants. And it feels at the moment that Ukraine has that technological advantage, but it doesn't have the scale advantage. Russia has the scale. It's producing Shahed drones in huge numbers. So again, it's about finance, innovation, and scale. And we're kind of failing at the moment. We need to do more to help the Ukrainians, and the immobilized Russian assets would have, really helped the Ukrainians scale up pretty quickly. And again, I think we'll see a solution towards the end of the year, but we're going to waste 2 months again. 2 months is critical in this war. Well, I think it's clear the Russians do, right? I mean, their narrative is that they're at war with NATO and Ukraine, right? I mean, that's their story. Do sanctions work? I always use the case of going way back, 2014, annexation of Crimea and the first imposition of sanctions by the West on Russia. Around April 14, I seem to remember, right? April to sort of June, July, that period. And if you remember that time, the Russians didn't expect any sanction after the annexation of Crimea, right? They were taking it back. And I do think that in that period between April and later in the year, the Russians were minded to have a much larger scale military intervention in Donbass, right? And at that point in time, the Ukrainian military were almost defenseless, which was, reflecting the fact that Crimea was taken in a couple of days, right? In the whole Donbass area, I don't think the Ukrainians would have been able to put up much of a better defense. What happened is the Russians delayed their eventual intervention in Donbass to kind of June, July that year, 2014, right? It gave the Ukrainians critical months to rejig, rebuild their defenses and get ready for what they knew was going to be inevitable, which is this Russian military intervention later that year, right? And it was sanctions that I think put the Russians on the back foot, made them, and if you remember, April 14, Russian markets got really badly impacted, right? Again, because people didn't expect it, right? And so I would say that's a specific example of sanctions actually working, particularly in Ukraine's favor at that point in time. And, if Ukraine hadn't been given that couple of months to better defend itself, the battlefield may have looked very different, right? I mean, Russian troops could have carved through large swathes of Ukraine in that period. So again, that's my personal reflection on that period. I may be wrong, but I certainly I looked at Ukraine in a lot of detail in that period. That's my view and my understanding, right? Let's say on the sanctions piece, initially they were imposed by the West to get Russia to change its actions, right? Get out of Crimea, get out of Donbass, and then obviously after the full-scale invasion, stop the full-scale invasion and pull back. If those commentators are right, if we're in World War III in effect already, I would actually argue that now the logic for sanctions goes beyond those initial desires, motivations to kind of stop Russia's actions. I think we have an interest now in weakening the Russian economy, keeping it weak, preventing Russia from regenerating its military capability lost in Ukraine, right? So we should keep sanctions in place as long as Russia remains a threat to us and Europe, right? And I do think, the sanctions in place are weakening Russia's economy. They are making it, they are reducing the export value of goods Russia exports. They're increasing the cost of imports. They're reducing the merchandise trade surplus and current account surplus, the accumulation of foreign exchange reserves that Russia then uses to buy imports to sustain the war machine, right? So, I think that for me is now probably the imperative in terms of why we should keep sanctions in place, right? Because Russia is clearly a threat to Ukraine, but it's a threat to European security. I mean, it has a track record. Litvinenko, Salisbury, the country that's used weapons of mass destruction on European streets is Russia, right? Extraordinary. What it is doing on a hybrid warfare, the drone activity, closing European airports, attacks on infrastructure. Russia has a problem with us, our system of government. He has a problem with Europe, right? So now, yes, sanctions have been less effective than they could have been. I would say that's more about implementation and then policing. Implementation, we've been far too slow. It's been sanctioned by the highest common denominator. We've allowed countries and companies to lobby for carve-outs because of their own particular interests. National security interests have been subordinate to commercial interests. And, in terms of making sure everyone is on board to send a unified political signal, again, it's given Russia's lots of time to figure out ways to get around sanctions. And then in terms of enforcement, right, secondary sanctions have been too weak. We've done very little to impose any cost on individuals, corporates and countries helping Russia break sanctions. UK is a great case in point. Who has gone to jail in the UK for helping Russia break sanctions? No one. Has there been any penalty imposed on anyone in the UK breaking sanctions? None. And there are plenty of cases where sanctions busters have been identified in the UK, right? So it pays to help Russia break sanctions. I mean, are we idiots? We've adopted a softly approach to third countries, whether it's Turkey, Central Asia, Gulf states, Dubai, etc. I mean, I guess, we could have gone hardball on those countries, imposing aggressive secondary sanctions. I guess the decision was we didn't want to force those countries into Russia's orbit, right? I would say that if that's the case, we're not confident enough in our own economic muscle and strength, right? I don't think, it's a great economic offering to Turkey, for example, or Dubai, etc., that, you will lose all your business with the Western world if you continue to help Russia break sanctions, and good luck if you think you can survive being wholly reliant on the Russian market, right? Just think about this. Russia is a 1.2 roughly $1 trillion economy. And the West combined is 60 trillion, multiples, 50 odd times larger than the Russian economy. All those countries that have decided it's good business to help Russia break sanctions, maybe they'd change their mind if they got cut off themselves from trading with that $60 trillion part of the global economy. I think the latter. I mean, it's a bit extraordinary where it's come from. We don't kind of know. There seems to have been a process between Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's advisor, over the last month. Rustem Umerov, the Ukrainian National Security Council chief, seems to be involved in that process as well. The Europeans weren't, which is kind of interesting. They seem to have been taken aback by it. I mean, reading it looks, a peace deal very much on Russia's terms. I find it very difficult to imagine that a Ukrainian leader could accept this and survive in office. In the end, for Ukraine, whatever peace terms are agreed, they have to assure the survival and prospect for successful development of the country going forward, right? And security is key to that. This document seems to suggest that Ukraine de facto will accept the loss of territory, Crimea, Donbass, Luhansk, and conceding, giving up additional territory in Donbass. The security guarantees still are pretty weak in my mind. That's the key for the country to go forward. And it looks, I guess it looks like Europe's been undermined and have the carpet pulled out from under it yet again by the Trump administration. I mean, there are different interpretations. Tatiana may have a different view, but it looks like the Trump administration wants to change the news cycle again. Obviously, it's in difficulty domestically. Trump's popularity ratings are pretty low. There's the Epstein stuff going on in the background. And it's worrying that the Americans seem to want to get this done very quickly, right? I'm sure Ukraine, wants to try and renegotiate lots of this document. I'm not sure, a week's time or so before Thanksgiving will give them the ability to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what the Europeans come up with. Obviously, they're on the plane or they're in Johannesburg at G20. I understand European leaders have been pulled out of meetings to talk to Trump around this sort of agenda. I guess, look, in the end, we seem to be back to where we were in February with the Trump administration working on its own agenda in its own interests, seeming to put Russia's interests above Ukraine. So the question now is, what agency does Ukraine have to pull back from all this? I don't know, but disappointing, I guess, for Ukraine ultimately. Alex Stubb uses his golf skills to great effect to have influence on President Trump to pull him back from this document. It appears to me, I mean, maybe the US administration is, just going back a little bit to what Tatiana said, it looks like there are different tensions, fissures, whatever within the Trump administration, right? I mean, it does seem like a group within the Trump administration, I think probably including Trump himself, are trying to force this deal on Ukraine. I mean, Secretary of the Army Driscoll was in Kiev over the last couple of days. It looks like he revealed the terms of this deal to President Zelensky. So, I think Trump does want this deal. I think he thinks, I mean, I would possibly push back a little bit on what Tatjana said. I mean, I think there's a bit of opportunism here, right? I mean, there's a feeling perhaps in the Trump administration and maybe in Moscow that the Energoatom scandal, the Pokrovsk situation has weakened Zelensky, made him vulnerable, and made him more willing to deal and accept an unpalatable deal. So I think there's a bit of that going on, opportunism from the Trump administration, opportunism and profiteering, as Tatjana said. Right? I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really, to think about it, that Ukraine, that's suffered probably hundreds of thousands of casualties in this war, is being charged for defending Europe and European values, right? I mean, I just find it unbelievable that a US administration, the leader of the free world, can do that when Ukraine is obviously fighting for freedom. In terms of the Europeans, as you rightly said, I mean, they're on the line for the 100 billion a year annual bill for supporting Ukraine. They are writing checks. They have been since the Trump administration assumed office. I mean, the harsh reality, though, is that Europe, because of its failures over the last 30 years, its focus on EU enlargement and less on its own security, means that it is still dependent on the US for weapons and munitions and ultimately the security backstop, right? And yes, suddenly Europe has kind of figured it out that the US is not necessarily a reliable partner, and it needs to have its own independent military capability to be able to defend itself. It's going to take a very long time to do that, right? And the irony really is that Ukraine, the longer Ukraine can hold out, it's a front line obviously against Russian aggression anyway, but it buys Europe time to put that independent military capability in place, right? I mean, it will take 4 to 5 years, I guess, for all this investment we're seeing in European defence to come to fruition, to the point that realistically it could actually defend itself without significant support from the Americans, right? I mean, and again, the Ukrainians are front line there, and they are helping Europe, but we are in a desperately difficult position, right? And Trump is exploiting that, I think, and Putin is playing Trump, as we all know, full and well, and it's all pretty unfortunate. And Ukrainians continue to pay the ultimate price in terms of their own blood, unfortunately. Well, interesting. I mean, I think Europe rolled over on tariffs earlier in the year because it understood its vulnerabilities on security. And I think the quid pro quo there, I guess, on the tariff front was the understanding that the Americans would continue to supply weapons to Ukraine and to Europe for cash, for payment, as long as Europe didn't make a big thing about the tariffs and didn't go down a retaliatory path. Europe could reopen that whole story. I mean, again, the threat from Russia, I mean, it's pretty clear now. European politicians really understanding now that Russia is an existential threat to the survival of Europe. I mean, I think it's clear now from Merz and Macron, and they get it finally. Too late, 3.5 years too late, perhaps, or even longer than that. But they do get it. How willing are they to make a stand on this issue, right? I would argue that this, if there's a cross for them to kind of die on, this is it. This is the existential battle. Ukraine, as I said, is the front line. Absolutely, now is the time to absolutely make it crystal clear to the Americans that if they value Europe as allies going forward, not just against Russia, or that's the wrong messaging around Trump, but against China, for example, then they really have to deliver this time around. I don't think Europe's been particularly good at selling its story to the Americans, particularly, right? They have leverage. I mean, they're huge. Europe is a huge economy, right? $27 trillion, euros total. And if the Americans think the ultimate battle is with China, Europe is now getting its defense spending and military industrial complex in order. Again, it will take 4 to 5 years to develop. But if the Americans are thinking somewhere down the line there's going to be there's a hegemonic battle with the Chinese militarily, they absolutely will need the Europeans by their side. And I think if the Americans don't stand up by our side this time around, then I don't think Europe should be there when the American knocks on the door about China, right? So, again, we will be spending huge amount of money on munitions going forward, and that's a huge market for the Americans again. I mean, much bigger. It's interesting that MBS was in the US this week, and he was talking about 140 billion odd of defense purchases from the Americans. I mean, Europe will be spending multiples of that. So again, we have to use our leverage, I think. I mean, maybe just going back a bit. I mean, in terms of this deal in particular. I mean, I'm sure Tatiana will agree with me. And I guess the problem in all this is that a fundamental lack of understanding of Putin by Trump and his team. Right? I don't think he kind of gets, how important Ukraine is to Putin. This deal. I mean, the problem for all of us is, this deal will be a transitory deal from Putin's perspective, right? We know he wants the whole of Ukraine. Absolutely crystal clear, right? He doesn't. It's not just about Donbass. It's not just about Crimea. It was never about only those regions. He wants, he obviously wrote that essay in the middle of 21, just before the full-scale invasion, to provide justification for Russian troops that were going to go into Ukraine eventually. This is why the invasion happened, right? Because Putin wants the whole of Ukraine, right? So this deal is meant to be a bad deal because Putin knows it will politically, socially, and economically destabilize Ukraine, right? I mean, as Tatiana said, I mean, it'll be incredibly difficult for a Ukrainian president to sell this deal, giving up territory in exchange for very, very weak security assurances. And no assurance that the Russians won't continue to undermine and destabilize Ukraine going forward, because that's what they want, right? I mean, I refer to the language that, I mean, we're getting new tidbits from this as we go along. I mean, I noticed Axios, Barak David is sending stuff out, and in the forward to the agreement, I know that the Americans say something like the United States affirms that a significant, deliberate and sustained armed attack by Russian Federation across the agreed armistice line into Ukraine shall be regarded as an attack threatening the peace and security of the transatlantic community. In such an event, the President of the United States shall, in exercise of constitutional authority and after immediate consultation with the Ukraine, NATO and European partners, determine the measures necessary to restore security. These measures may include armed force, intelligence, and logistical assistance, economic and diplomatic actions, etc., etc. I think the key there is the terms used at the start, that a significant, deliberate and sustained armed attack by the Russian Federation across the armistice line. I mean, so Russia can, after this peace is agreed, continue to attack Ukraine as long as it's not sustained and it's not that significant. I mean, what does that mean? So Russia continue to launch the occasional missile strike against Ukraine, and that will be acceptable for the Americans, right? I mean, look, in the end, if Ukraine is to successfully develop economically, it needs security, right? International business going into Ukraine need to know that Russia is not going to lob missiles here and there onto Ukrainian territory. And that statement from the Americans is not really strong enough in my mind, right? I mean, it needs to be cast iron, right? I mean, if Russia launches one missile, like we saw this week in Western Ukraine, that kills people, that should trigger the security assurance from the Americans. It's crystal clear. I mean, this document, this statement, is blurry. I mean, it's almost as blurry as the Budapest Memorandum. Trump cares about money, clearly, right? And, if Europe did move quickly to confiscate the 200 billion-ish immobilized Russian assets in our jurisdiction and then committed to use that to buy weapons from the Americans, I don't think Trump would say no to that, right? In the end, Europe and Ukraine's problem is not money. Europe's problem is not particularly the money. We can find solutions there. It's the equipment, right? And again, unfortunately, we're reliant on the Americans for the supply of that equipment. And I don't think Trump would be able to say no to a enormous arms procurement program. I mean, the 200 billion in immobilized Russian assets to be used to buy weapons for Europe and Ukraine, and then Europe's own defense procurement needs, which will inevitably, in the short to medium term, significantly around the Americans. So in the end, that's our leverage, I guess. Europe's use to the Americans as a expanding, growing military industrial complex, helping the Americans counter the threat from China going forward. But, creating jobs in the US, right? And we have to absolutely move. I mean, if anything has sent a clear message to Europe, that we need to get our act together finally on the immobilized Russian assets in European jurisdictions, including the UK, I should say that this should be it, right? Why are we messing around? It's just extraordinary. Over 3.5 years since the first immobilization, right? And, we are still debating it, right? And, obviously the reparation loan suggestion is what Europe or the European Commission seems to have come up with. It's imperfect, right? There are better and easier things to do. Again, Tatjana and myself would say that, confiscation is the obvious and much easier thing to do. And again, the reparation loan, the Belgians have, put forward various problems with reparation loan idea. I can think of lots of solutions that would get around the Belgians' problems. And these solutions were suggested more than 3.5 years ago. I mean, it's a sad reflection of the lack of leadership in Europe that we are where we are now, and we're still talking about this issue when it should have been done, right? But anyway, there you go. At least the reparation loan idea, despite its drawbacks, in theory, could see the release of funds for Ukraine relatively quickly. If we get a decision at the European Council meeting on December the 19th, let's hope that does happen. Lawrence Freeman was at Chatham House last week, and he made the point that Putin, can't accept a ceasefire because the war's been pretty disastrous, right? I mean, this deal is kind of interesting in terms of there's plenty of carrot in this deal for Putin, right? I mean, he gets the territories, he occupies de facto. The Americans accept the recognition of Russian control of Donbass and Crimea. Russia's welcome back into G8. It gets a significant amount of its immobilized Russian assets back. There's talk of big investment deals between the Russians and the Americans. I mean, there's a great big welcome sign put up by Trump and the US administration for Russia as part of this, right? A normalized and also the amnesty for all the war crimes that have been committed by Russia and Russians in Ukraine. And I guess Ukraine will have to give up any hope of reparations. I mean, I think that's part of this deal as well. So Putin, I'm sure, can sell this as a win back home. Remember, he controls the information narrative in Russia. And as you've alluded to there, I mean, I think Putin will still see this peace deal as kind of a base camp to further intervention against Ukraine. Yes. There is no way anyone who, I mean, Tatjana, I'm sure, has followed Putin's progress in office since 99, as I have, over 25 years. It's absolutely crystal clear to me and other Russia watchers that Putin will not stop here. He will sign this deal knowing that he can break it going forward, and he will wake up every morning thinking how he can destabilize and undermine Ukraine.
And Europe and NATO, let's not forget.
Yeah. I mean, he's done that for 20 years, right? The whole strategy of Russia under Putin to Ukraine over the last 20 years has been about undermining its sovereignty, security, undermining its economy, making it more dependent on Russia, to secure the control again of Ukraine by Russia. The fact that those policies were kind of failing in late 2013 and then with Euromaidan in 2014 spurred Russia's
annexation of Crimea, intervention in Donbass in 2014, and then ultimately the full-scale invasion in 22. That is not going to stop, right? That's the harsh reality. And I don't think the Trump administration, I mean, guys like Witkoff, I mean, they have no track record or history following Russia or Ukraine particularly. I mean, they don't understand the story, right? They don't get Putin, I don't think, ultimately. And that's the fundamental problem, right? I think Ukrainians absolutely do understand the Putin regime, and I think Europe is increasingly understanding of what Putin's about. And they do get that this is an existential battle, right, for Europe, for Ukraine. So anyway, let's hope that European leaders can talk some sense into Trump. And, in the end, Putin respects power, strength, force. He takes advantage of weakness, right? And I think this is a weak response from the Trump administration. And Putin will exploit that.
Well, look, let's look at the positives to start with, right? I mean, finally, we have acceptance by the IMF and the European Commission that there is this financing hole for Ukraine for 26, 27, and then to 29, right? So the fund estimates that the budget financing gap is $140 billion for the period, for the 4-year program that they're talking about from 26 to 29, right? And then the Commission, in its paper, in terms of provided, because the Belgians asked for it, in terms of the requirement, the funding gap from a total financing perspective for 26, 27 is also 140 billion euros this time, right? So what we know is that Ukraine is underfunded, right? So that at the moment, given the Americans have stepped back, the rest of the world, or the West of the Western Alliance, what's left of it, basically have to meet that shortfall, or Ukraine will be underfunded, not able to defend itself, could fail, and then we all know the costs to Europe will be catastrophic if that happens. As I've mentioned many, many times, tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west because they don't want to live in an authoritarian system, which is how this all started, I guess, in 2013, Euromaidan 2014. Actually, go back to Orange Revolution, if anything, for 04, 05, right? Ukrainians will not stay under Putin. They will leave. That will create huge political, social, and economic pressures in Europe, massive increase in defense spending, probably an extra $1 trillion a year needed in defense spending. So that's the need, or that's the ask. So the European Commission figured out it had this problem. They went away, thought about solutions. In the end, the realization is European taxpayers probably not willing to fund that money. And I think morally, it's right that Russian taxpayers pay. I mean, guys like me and other people have been arguing it's the right thing to do. We have this money sitting in bank accounts doing nothing in Europe and everywhere else or lots of other places in the world. Why don't we utilize it to make Russia pay for the brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, the fact that it's breaking international law? Let's turn it around and use it to fund Ukraine, to help it buy weapons to defend itself and defend us, right? So anyway, the Commission came up with their preferred option was this reparation loan idea, something that I'd suggested over 3 years ago, but anyway, whatever. Anyway, they came up with this idea. Essentially, money sitting in Euroclear, this is the Belgian depository. There is a debt contract with the ECB in theory. That money is then used by Europe to fund a reparation loan to Ukraine. If Ukraine gets reparations from Russia, subsequently the money's paid back essentially, right? And everyone thought it was a great idea. The Belgians said, we hate this idea. They have spent the last 3.5 years lobbying against it. I mean, it was, I thought the irony today that the Belgian foreign minister was saying our voice has not been heard. Unfortunately, the Belgians' voice has been heard for the last 3.5 years, which is one of the main reasons why mobilized Russian assets have not been used already, right? So the Belgians, Euroclear, have been lobbying aggressively against it. But anyway, the Belgians said, we don't like it because what happens if Russia wins a legal case, or lodges and wins a legal case in Belgium or other courts in Europe, and we have to pay the money back and the money's gone, it's in Ukraine. What happens then? Or what happens, for example, if that the Europeans, they have this biannual sanctions rollover that keeps the assets immobilized. What happens if the Hungarians or the Slovaks block that process? Again, we would have to pay the money back in full. Fair enough, right? I mean, it's a risk. I think it's a low risk. It's a low risk because, well, the two angles to that. It's very unlikely that Russia would lodge a lawsuit in Belgium, because to do so, it would have to lift its own sovereign immunity, and likely, Russia is on the cost. The damage to Ukraine is probably $1 trillion, right? So to defend its 330 billion, potentially it would leave itself open to cases looking for the $1 trillion. Interestingly, the assets under the reparation loan are not seized. They are simply retooled. The asset is still owned by Russia. It's a clever way of avoiding full seizure. And actually, I don't think there's much of a change in the move to reparation loan from what we have already in mobilization. And 3.5 years, Russia has not launched any lawsuits in Belgium on immobilization. So why would they on the move to reparation loan idea? But anyway, that legal action would probably take years and years, probably over 5 years. So I mean, the Belgians said, well, if it happens, where are we going to get the liquidity from? The European Commission hoped the ECB would provide that short-term liquidity, even with guarantees provided for this reparation loan. And the ECB and Lagarde kind of was missing in action this week and said, "Oh, we're not going to do that. We would break treaty obligations for doing that." I mean, the interesting thing about that is that one, as I said, any legal action is likely to be very long term, right? So, I think Europe would have some time to think about the possibility of losing an action in Belgian courts or European courts and getting its act together and finding the liquidity potentially to pay that back. And the other angle is the rollover of the sanctions and immobilization. Interestingly, there's a paper today, or a attempt by Europe to address some of the Belgian concerns, and it suggests that potentially there's an emergency ordinance in the European Commission kind of rules, etc., that potentially allows a move from unanimous voting on these issues to qualified majority voting, right? So that could potentially ensure that there was some surety in terms of the immobilization of the assets, that the sanctions wouldn't be lifted, and in theory the underlying assets would have to go back to Russia. So that's some kind of assurance. But as I said, I think the risks that Russia would launch a legal action and win that action in a European court, given that it's trodden on international law already and the assets have not been seized, I think is very low. I mean, I would say it's less than 10% probability. And as I said, it's not going to happen soon. It's going to take a very, very long time to adjudicate that particular ruling. So Europe's got lots of time to get its act together. Now, in terms of the guarantees, the other angle is, well, how about Europe indemnifying Belgium for a worst case scenario that in the end Russia launches a case, wins a case at some time in the future, and then Belgium's on the hook for the full 190 billion or whatever it is. Well, sure. I mean, I think in that case, Europe should pool the risk, right? I think it's fair for the European countries to say, fair enough. Belgium's holding the bulk of these assets. By allowing the transfer of these assets to be used to support Ukraine, this is a common good for Europe. We should all stand behind Belgium for that in that instance. I think there is probably agreement across Europe that happens. I should also say that I find anyone arguing against it is a bit ridiculous if you think about it, because essentially the question or the decision point is this: either we say we're not going to use immobilized Russian assets, and we have to fund 140 billion. And so we have to spend the money now from our taxpayers, right? We have to go to taxpayers and say, sorry, guys, we want to protect Russian central bank assets. We want to protect Russian taxpayer money at all costs, because we think that this money is so important to Russia that we have to defend their interests above everything else. And you're going to pay. And it's probably going to be the German taxpayer ultimately, but whatever. So anyway, the decision is taken to spend our taxpayers' money now, or we go with the reparation loan idea, or we go after immobilization. And at some point in the future, like I said, 5 years plus, there is a small probability that we lose the lawsuit, and then we have to pay the 140 billion back. You know, it's a no-brainer, right? You will always take the risk with the immobilized assets and the reparation loan, because there's a high probability you won't have to pay it back. Where it's a dead cert that if we don't use the immobilized reparation assets, we have to spend our own taxpayers' money. I mean, it's idiocracy.
It's madness. They're not going to sue for multiples of that amount.
But anyway,
yeah.
I think I've probably said enough there to kick things off and stir people's emotions. Look, you know, I'm part of a working group I'm an economist, but there's legal guys I work with, and you know, there is this legal argument called countermeasures, right? And the legal case has been made for seizure. I buy it. It's this line that a country only benefits from sovereign immunity when it's in compliance with international law, right? And when countries are out of accordance with international law, you know, their sovereign immunity lapses, and then countermeasures can be applied. That's sanctions, and you can basically seize the assets, and you can structure something like a reparation loan or something like that after seizure that could meet the requirements, I think, of international law. And I think seizing sends a very strong message, right, to Russia that there is a price attached to its bad actions, right? And actually, you know, an argument is made against seizure that, well, what about other potential bad actors around the world, you know, Chinese, etc. You know, would they, you know, see this as a reason to pull their assets out of, you know, reserve currencies, for example? I mean, my message there is, well, don't do the bad actions, right? I mean, if you're planning on invading another country and committing war crimes, well, maybe it's not a good idea if your assets are in Belgium and Euroclear, right? Maybe you would think twice about doing those kind of things. You know, if there was this potential sanction that your foreign exchange reserves would be seized. So, you know, we shouldn't be scared by this. And in the end, look, you know, others on the call know more about this than I do. But look, in the end, what we've learned about Putin is he respects power and strength. You know, you appease Putin, he walks all over you, right? And I think seizing would send an incredibly strong signal to Putin that we are serious, right? And, you know, in the end, we've gone down the reparation loan route because, you know, we haven't had leadership, frankly, in G7 by the Biden administration. You know, they had lots of time to go down the seizure route. They you know, and interestingly, there were people in the administration who were very supportive of moving to seize the assets. And in the end, Biden made the decision he didn't want to do that. That was a massive mistake. And then, you know, unfortunately, because he didn't do that, we've been left hostage to the Trump administration, playing lots of different games around this. So, you know, I'm a strong believer in seizure. I think there's a legal case to be made. I think it sends a very strong signal to Russia. And we don't mess around with the intricacies now with the reparation loan. But look, in the end, we are where we are. I bought the reparation loan idea because I thought this is what the European Commission could get over the line. And in the end, you know, needs must. Ukraine absolutely has this financing shortfall in 26, 27. We have to fill it or Ukraine loses. Time is of the essence. You know, our bureaucrats have wasted 3.5 years on this, doing nothing. You know, and that's a travesty. You know, I mean, the number of times, you know, I've met British politicians or MPs, and you talk to them and you say, or German politicians or whoever it is, you explain to them, look, we can either use, you know, Russian taxpayer money to fund Ukraine, or we can use your own taxpayer money to fund Ukraine. I mean, it's that simple. And it's like a eureka moment. It's like, oh my God, Tim, what a fantastic idea. Why don't we do it? And, you know, in the UK, I mean, I've spoken to Labour Party guys, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, Scottish Nationalists, Liberal, you name it. They all support it. They go away and they say, this is a fantastic idea. What do we need to get it done? And then it gets stuck in the Bank of England or Her Majesty's Treasury, whose job is to think about ways to not do things like this. And as I've said, you know, the ECB, the British Treasury, the French Treasury, the German Treasury, this is a national security issue, right? It's not a finance issue, actually, right? And Putin thinks he's at war with us. I mean, that's the reality, and we are in a war with Russia. I mean, that's the reality. He's waging war on us, and this is about survival. It's an existential threat to our way of living, our way of governance, right? And you need to do extraordinary things. And I think, the ECB, UK Treasury, they just didn't really get it, right? And really, it's about leadership. It's about the guys at the top of our political systems, that's the prime ministers and presidents, telling treasuries and central banks to get this done. I mean, again, Lagarde at the ECB, she's come up with all these reasons why the ECB can't provide the liquidity backstop for the reparation loan. Why is she making that determination, right? Does she know that the scale of the national security risk to Europe from Russia, and what happens if this doesn't happen? As I said, the bigger risk to the euro and the stability of European financial markets and confidence in European financial markets is not if we immobilize or we seize these assets. If we don't, Ukraine loses. Europe massively loses. Again, the financial cost, the economic cost to Europe will be extraordinarily large for many years to come. I mean, the $1 trillion extra defense spending I mentioned is per year, right? It's not a one-off. So imagine the impact of the euro of that. It will be higher budget deficits, higher borrowing costs, higher interest rates, lower growth, and a weaker euro. So I don't get what planet Lagarde is on, but she's certainly not showing any leadership on this issue. Yeah, look, I mean, I did think that whoever won the US election, there would be a peace process, right? I think both sides late last year were kind of thinking about it and waiting to see the outcome of the election, right? I mean, I think Ukraine thought a Harris win would improve their position. I think Putin thought a Trump win would improve his position. But and in the end, I thought, Putin, Freudian slip. Putin, I think in the end, again, this idea that he respects power and strength, I think we had to increase the costs to him of continuing the war, right? Cost militarily, which, I would assume the Harris presidency would have increased military support Ukraine to increase the military losses for Russia of continuing the war, but then also maxed out on sanctions and obviously going after immobilized Russian assets is part of that process, right? To change Putin's calculus, to make him realize that he's not going to get anything more from continuing the war, and the West is united, and I think a deal could have been worked out, right? In my mind, and in the end, the Trump presidency came in. Trump, I think, just wanted a quick deal, and in the end, gave away everything right at the start, right? I mean, made it absolutely clear to Putin, that he gave away all the negotiating points, right? No NATO, no security guarantees. Russia keeps all the territory it gets, returns to international markets. Sanctions are off. I mean, the Russians couldn't believe their luck, right? And then Putin figured out, well, actually, I can outlast these guys. They are idiots, and I just play hardball, and in the end, the West collapses and Trump delivers everything I want, right? So, but I think we're still in the same place. I mean, I think in the end, to get a fair deal for Ukraine, you have to max out the pressure on Russia militarily and from a financial perspective. There's lots more we can do from a sanctions front, again, immobilize Russian assets. What a message that sends if you think about it, right? I mean, we are gonna take 330 billion away from Russia, and we are gonna give it to Ukraine so they can buy weapons. I mean, it buys a lot of weapons, right? I mean, that's a couple of years of funding. It tells the Russians that the Ukrainians are not going anywhere for 2 years, and they can cause a lot of damage, right? And I think the Russian economy also late last year was looking increasingly vulnerable. Growth was slowing, inflation was rising. There were some strange decisions from the central bank. And then obviously Trump came and there was a bit of relief. But actually, interestingly, the Ukrainian actions now, if you look at the attacks on the oil refinery sector in particular, I mean, some of those hits by the Ukrainians, deep strike hits on Russia's economic infrastructure are having an impact. The Lukoil Rosneft sanctions, finally, I mean, to give Trump some credit, I mean, actually, that was a seismic move. And we are seeing the impact now in terms of there's been a collapse of Russian energy export revenues, right? I mean, the noose, despite everything that Trump's doing, you know, the Russian economy is not in a great place. It is getting more difficult for Russia and Russians. And we can further tighten the noose relatively easily, right? Actually, we should be doing that again to force Putin into serious negotiations, to deliver a deal that, in the end, ensures that Ukraine is sustainable long term, so it's sustainable, successful, and actually economically self-sustaining, that it can fund its own defense, right? I mean, you know, again, we can maybe talk about the elements of a peace deal, but you know, I've long argued that you know, NATO membership is great, but actually the best assurance of Ukraine's defense is itself, right? It has fought valiantly for 3.5 years, despite our underfunding and our drip feed of military equipment. I mean, if we guaranteed them like a state of Israel kind of support, you know, we guaranteed to give you the full range of top-notch conventional military kit, short of nuclear, right? So you can outgun Russia. You don't need necessarily 600,000 troops or 800,000. I mean, if you have a high-tech, top-of-the-range NATO military kit, you can, you know, the still porcupine idea, right? And you know, that's what we should be aiming for. And actually, the 330 billion of CBR assets could help deliver that, right? I mean, they could help fund, you know, Ukraine's, you know, its upgrading of its military capability to a point that it outguns Russia.